The first thing that shattered wasn't the glass. It was the confidence inside Vought Tower when a white-haired man walked through a sealed executive window without slowing down, as if the wall had politely stepped aside for him. Security responded exactly as trained. Rifles fired at point-blank range, grenades clattered across marble floors, and armored teams flooded the hallway in perfect formation. None of it reached him. Bullets slowed, twisted, and stopped in the air inches from his clothes, hanging there like decorations in a museum exhibit. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just looked around with open curiosity, like a tourist who had entered the wrong building by accident and decided to explore anyway. 30 seconds later, Homelander landed hard enough to crack the floor and fired his heat vision without asking a single question. The beam bent and stalled before touching the stranger's face. For the first time in years, Homelander looked uncertain inside his own headquarters. And downstairs, in the executive floors, someone whispered what would become painfully obvious too late. This isn't an attack. It's a problem we don't understand yet. What you're seeing is the first crack in a system built on manufactured power and fear. Stay with this story, because the consequences don't stop here. Subscribe once, or you'll miss how this single visit begins dismantling Vought from the inside. The alarms in Vought Tower didn't trigger because of a breach. They triggered because the system couldn't classify what it was seeing. Cameras showed a man stepping through reinforced glass without breaking stride, as if the building itself had briefly forgotten how to be solid. His white hair caught the emergency lights in a soft glow, while security teams flooded the corridor with trained precision and very real fear. The first wave fired immediately. Rifles roared in a confined hallway, grenades clattered across polished floors, and orders were shouted over comms in clipped panic. None of it reached him. Bullets slowed, twisted, and stopped inches from his coat like they had hit an invisible ocean. Explosions blossomed outward and tore apart the very men who threw them, while the stranger stood untouched in the middle of the chaos, looking around with casual curiosity. Gojo Satoru tilted his head slightly as if trying to understand what kind of place he had walked into. He examined the frozen bullets with mild interest, then stepped past them, leaving the suspended projectiles hanging in the air behind him like decorations. His expression wasn't hostile, it was entertained. When the elevator doors at the end of the hall burst open, the air itself seemed to tense. Homelander didn't walk out. He landed hard enough to fracture marble, eyes already glowing red before his feet settled. He didn't ask for a report. He didn't ask for identification. He simply fired. The beam crossed the hallway in an instant and then stopped, bending like light refracting through deep water. It hovered inches from Gojo's face, humming with lethal heat, unable to move forward or dissipate. For a long second, the only sound was the low vibration of trapped energy and the distant crackling of burning debris. Gojo leaned slightly to the side, inspecting the stalled beam with open fascination. He raised one hand and waved through it as if testing whether it was real. His fingers never touched the light, yet the gesture made it clear he understood exactly what was happening. Homelander stopped firing, not because he wanted to, but because confusion had overridden instinct. He had never seen his power fail to obey him. He had never seen anyone stand still in front of him without fear. That uncertainty spread through him faster than anger. Gojo finally spoke, his voice calm and almost friendly. He asked Homelander if this was a demonstration or a greeting. The tone wasn't mocking. It was genuinely conversational, like a teacher trying to understand a student's overly aggressive introduction. Down on the executive floors, feeds from dozens of cameras were pulled into one wall-sized display. Vought International executives watched security teams fall apart around a man who hadn't thrown a single punch. The analytics teams were already scrambling, trying to categorize him as a variant, a foreign soup, an experimental asset, anything that fit into a known box. He didn't fit. Homelander rushed forward, closing the distance in less than a second, and swung with enough force to turn armored vehicles into scrap metal. His fist stopped mid-swing, hovering in front of Gojo's chest as if caught in invisible cement. The muscles in Homelander's arm strained. Veins rose along his neck. The punch simply refused to complete. Gojo glanced down at the trapped fist and then back up at Homelander with mild amusement. He commented that this kind of direct approach was very honest, but not very interesting. The words weren't cruel, but they landed with humiliating precision. Homelander pulled back and tried again, faster, harder, angrier. The result was identical. Every attack stopped inches away, like reality itself had drawn a boundary he could not cross. For the first time since he had become Vought's golden god, Homelander looked like a man trying to punch through glass he couldn't see. Gojo stepped around him casually, not pushing him aside, not resisting, simply walking past as if Homelander was a piece of furniture in a hallway. That quiet dismissal hit harder than any counterattack could have. The cameras caught the exact moment Homelander realized he wasn't being challenged. He was being ignored. Security teams regrouped further down the corridor, heavier weapons coming into play, but none of them fired. They had already seen what happened when they tried. The man wasn't defending himself. The world was defending him. Gojo stopped in front of a large digital directory displaying Vought's departments. He scanned it like a visitor looking for the right office in a government building. He asked aloud whether there was a tour guide available, because this place seemed important but terribly organized. Homelander hovered behind him, seething, unsure whether to attack again or demand answers. The hesitation was visible, and that visibility was new. Gojo hadn't hurt him. He had forced him into a position he had never occupied before: uncertainty. In a surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, Billy Butcher watched the live feed with narrowed eyes. He had seen Sups bleed, scream, and die. He had never seen one stand inside a storm of violence without even acknowledging it. He muttered that this bloke didn't move like a soup at all. Gojo finally turned around to face Homelander again, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed. He asked him if he worked here, because the uniform suggested authority but the behavior suggested insecurity. The comment wasn't loud, but it traveled through the microphones clearly enough for the entire executive floor to hear. Homelander's jaw tightened. His entire identity rested on dominance, and here was a stranger who wasn't impressed, wasn't threatened, and wasn't even trying. He launched upward, slammed into the ceiling, and came back down with a shockwave meant to rattle the entire floor. The shockwave never reached Gojo. It stopped at the same invisible boundary as everything else, rippling harmlessly around him like wind around a statue. And that was the moment the people watching realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration, not by Homelander but by the visitor. Gojo looked around at the wreckage, at the suspended bullets, at the burned walls and broken bodies, and sighed softly as if the situation had become slightly less entertaining. He mentioned that he had hoped for a conversation, not a fireworks display. Then he began walking toward the executive elevators. Homelander didn't follow immediately. For the first time in his life, he hesitated to approach someone inside his own building. That hesitation was captured on every camera, streamed into every secure room, and burned into the minds of everyone who saw it. Because in that pause, Vought understood something irreversible. This man wasn't here to fight. He was here to look. And the moment he stepped into the executive elevator, leaving Homelander standing in the ruined hallway, the power structure inside Vought Tower shifted in a way that could never be undone. The executive floor of Vought Tower was built to feel untouchable. Soundproof glass, biometric doors, and layers of private security existed not to keep enemies out, but to maintain the illusion that no enemy could ever reach this level in the first place. That illusion died the moment the elevator chimed softly and the doors slid open without resistance. Gojo stepped out as if he had arrived for a scheduled meeting. He looked around with open curiosity, taking in the polished wood, the quiet lighting, the wall of screens replaying footage from the hallway he had just left. His own image was frozen on multiple displays, bullets hanging in the air around him like ornaments. Inside the main boardroom, executives sat frozen in their seats. Some stared at the screens. Others stared at the elevator. None of them moved toward the emergency buttons under the table. They all understood that whatever had just walked through their building would not be stopped by locked doors. Stan Edgar didn't stand. He remained seated at the head of the table, hands folded, expression controlled with years of practiced authority. He had managed Homelander with nothing but composure and carefully chosen words. He believed control came from never appearing shaken. But even he didn't yet know how to categorize what he was looking at. Gojo walked into the room without asking permission and glanced at the long table like he was deciding where to sit in a classroom. He commented that the place had the atmosphere of people who believed they were very important, which made him curious about what they actually did all day. No one answered. Stan Edgar finally spoke, voice even, asking who he was and how he had entered the building. It was a reasonable question asked with deliberate calm, the kind used to reassert hierarchy. Gojo smiled slightly and replied that walking in had been easier than expected, and that he had assumed this place would be more difficult to visit. The security detail outside the room tried to reposition. They were armed, armored, and terrified, but none of them crossed the doorway. They had watched the hallway footage. Training told them to act. Instinct told them to stay exactly where they were. Gojo's eyes moved to the screens showing the paused image of Homelander mid-attack. He tilted his head and asked if the flying man was their employee, because he seemed very eager but not very effective. The comment wasn't cruel. It was observational, like a teacher grading a student's first attempt at something ambitious. Inside the room, several executives shifted uncomfortably. They were used to seeing fear when Homelander's name was mentioned. Hearing a stranger casually critique him like an underperforming intern did something worse than insult. It destabilized their understanding of power. Stan Edgar asked if Gojo was a soup created by a foreign government, testing whether he could place him inside a political framework he understood. Gojo laughed softly and admitted he didn't know what a soup was, but he had guessed this building had something to do with artificial heroes because the atmosphere felt manufactured. That word lingered in the air, manufactured. Before anyone could respond, the boardroom lights flickered briefly as something heavy landed outside. Through the glass walls, several figures could be seen approaching the corridor with deliberate caution. Queen Maeve walked at the front, jaw tight, eyes assessing the situation with a soldier's focus rather than Homelander's ego. Behind her, Black Noir moved silently, already analyzing angles and attack vectors. Further back, trying to look brave but clearly unsettled, was the Deep, whose confidence rarely survived outside water. They entered the room slowly, not attacking but positioning. This wasn't an ambush. It was a containment attempt. Gojo turned to look at them with visible interest. He greeted them casually, as if new classmates had arrived late to a lecture. He asked if they were part of the same organization, because they all wore expressions that suggested they were used to being the strongest people in the room. Maeve spoke first. She asked him what he wanted, not aggressively but directly. She had seen enough of Homelander to recognize the signs of something that didn't behave normally. Gojo appreciated the straightforward question and admitted he wasn't sure yet. He had sensed a strange concentration of unnatural energy in this city and decided to investigate. Black Noir moved faster than anyone else in the room could track. In a blur, he launched a blade directly toward Gojo's throat. The weapon stopped midair, hanging motionless inches from Gojo's skin. Noir's follow-up strike froze the same way. He stepped back immediately, not out of fear but out of tactical recalculation. Gojo glanced at the suspended blade and gently pushed it aside without touching it. He remarked that this was getting repetitive and asked if anyone here preferred talking over throwing things. The Deep took an involuntary step backward. Stan Edgar watched all of this without interrupting. His mind was already shifting away from defense and toward analysis. This wasn't a threat that could be stopped with force. This was a variable that had to be understood before it destroyed everything by accident. He asked Gojo to sit. Gojo happily pulled out a chair and sat at the executive table like he belonged there. The casualness of the gesture was more unsettling than violence. He leaned back and folded his hands, waiting politely as if he had just arrived for a scheduled interview. Outside the room, employees were evacuating floors in controlled panic. News helicopters were beginning to circle the building after reports of explosions. Vought's PR department was already drafting statements about a gas line incident that no one believed would hold up for more than an hour. Inside the room, the air felt heavier with every passing second. Gojo asked them what their organization actually did. Stan Edgar explained Vought's public mission in measured corporate language. Gojo listened patiently, and then pointed out that none of that explained why so many people in this building behaved like they were afraid of one man. No one mentioned Homelander's name. Maeve watched Gojo closely, realizing something important before the others did. He wasn't trying to intimidate them. He genuinely didn't see them as threats. That indifference was what made the situation dangerous. Because people who don't feel threatened don't feel restrained. A distant crash echoed through the tower as Homelander finally forced himself to move again, smashing through floors in a direct line toward the executive level. The vibration traveled through the glass and into the table itself. Gojo glanced toward the sound and smiled slightly, like someone hearing an impatient student running late to class. And for the first time since this began, Stan Edgar understood the scale of the problem. This man wasn't here to attack Vought. He was here to study it. And the more he observed, the more likely he was to decide something about it needed to change. The elevator dinged again behind them as Homelander arrived. By the time the executive elevator doors opened again, the entire internal network of Vought had shifted into emergency governance. Legal teams were drafting containment language. PR teams were building narratives for incidents that hadn't even happened yet. Research divisions were digging through decades of classified files, searching for anything that resembled what they had just witnessed on the security feeds. They found nothing. Inside the boardroom, the air had grown tense in a way that had nothing to do with fear of violence. It was the tension of people realizing their systems no longer applied. Policies, authority chains, contingency plans, none of it had meaning when the subject of the crisis was calmly sitting at their table, waiting for them to finish thinking. The elevator opened, and Homelander stepped out slowly this time. He didn't crash through walls. He didn't announce himself with noise. He walked into the room like a man trying to regain control of a situation he didn't understand. His eyes never left the white-haired stranger seated comfortably in the executive chair. Gojo greeted him casually, asking if he had finally decided to join the meeting. The tone wasn't mocking. That made it worse. Homelander didn't respond. He looked to Stan Edgar for instruction, a reflex he hated but couldn't suppress. Stan didn't give any. For the first time in their long, carefully managed relationship, Stan had no script for how to handle this. In a nearby monitoring room, Ashley Barrett was packing in tight circles, headset pressed to her ear, barking orders to departments that had no idea what they were supposed to do. She demanded status reports on every soup in the building, on evacuation progress, on media containment. None of the information felt useful. Every camera angle showed the same thing. A man who wasn't threatened. Stan Edgar finally shifted tactics. He didn't try to intimidate. He didn't try to threaten. He offered cooperation. He asked Gojo what he wanted to understand about Vought, phrasing it like a business opportunity instead of a crisis. Gojo appreciated the change in tone. He explained that he had sensed something unnatural gathering in this city, something layered and artificial. He wanted to see how it worked, not to destroy it, just to understand it. The word understand made several people in the room uncomfortable. Because the more someone understands a system, the easier it is to dismantle it. Homelander finally spoke, unable to tolerate the conversational tone any longer. He demanded to know what Gojo was, not who, what. The question came out sharper than he intended, edged with frustration he couldn't hide. Gojo thought about it for a moment before answering honestly. He said he was someone who dealt with problems that ordinary people couldn't perceive, that he specialized in things that pretended to be normal while quietly harming everyone around them. Several executives avoided eye contact. At that exact moment, the building lights flickered again, not from damage, but from power rerouting as Vought's R&D division activated deep-level protocols. Experimental scanning systems were turned on, designed to analyze soup physiology, radiation output, neurological patterns. They aimed everything at the boardroom. The sensors detected nothing that fit their databases. No compound V signature, no abnormal bioelectric patterns, no enhanced metabolism, just a man sitting in a chair, completely unreadable by every machine they had ever built to categorize power. Ashley's voice came through Stan Edgar's earpiece, tight with rising panic. She whispered that the scans were returning blank results. Stan's expression didn't change, but inside, the implications were expanding rapidly. Vought's entire empire was built on the belief that power could be measured, replicated, monetized, and controlled. This man existed outside all four. The situation shifted from security threat to existential threat for the corporation itself. Homelander tried again, stepping forward, invading Gojo's personal space in an attempt to reassert dominance. Gojo didn't move. He simply looked up at him with mild curiosity, as if observing a child attempting a trick he had already seen before. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Then Gojo asked a simple question that no one in the room was prepared for. He asked why everyone here seemed so afraid of their own creation. The room went still. No one answered, because answering would mean admitting something Vought had spent decades hiding, even from itself. Outside the tower, news vans had begun lining the streets. Helicopters circled overhead. Rumors were spreading through social media faster than Vought could suppress them. Employees fleeing the building were already telling stories that didn't match the official narrative. Inside, Stan Edgar realized the real danger was what Gojo might do. It was what he might say. Because this man saw through the illusion instantly, and he did it without anger, without agenda, without trying. He simply observed, and the truth revealed itself around him. That kind of presence was far more destructive than violence. Ashley reported another development. Several SUPs stationed across New York were refusing to enter the building after hearing what happened to the security teams. They were making excuses, stalling, waiting for instructions that didn't involve walking toward the unknown. For the first time, Vought's most valuable assets were hesitating. Homelander heard this through the comms and his jaw tightened. His authority depended on the illusion that nothing frightened him. Now that illusion was cracking and everyone could see it. Gojo leaned back in his chair and glanced around the table. He remarked that this place felt less like a headquarters and more like a carefully maintained lie. He said it gently, like an observation about interior design. Stan Edgar finally understood that the situation had moved beyond containment. This was no longer about removing a threat from the building. This was about preventing this man from spending too much time inside it. because the longer he stayed, the more Vought unraveled without him lifting a finger. And that realization triggered the first true corporate response. Stan discreetly authorized a classified protocol that had not been used in over a decade. A protocol designed not for enemies, but for uncontrollable subs. Deep below the tower, systems began to power on. Experimental weapons, psychological warfare programs, containment measures that had been considered too dangerous even for Homelander. Upstairs, Gojo smiled faintly, as if he had felt something change in the atmosphere. He asked, almost cheerfully, if they had finally decided to make things interesting. And far beneath Vought Tower, something built to control gods began to wake up. Outside Vought Tower, the streets of Manhattan had become a living perimeter. Police barricades stretched across avenues, news vans stacked bumper to bumper, and crowds gathered behind lines of flashing lights trying to understand why employees were being rushed out of one of the most secure buildings in the country. Helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting images of shattered windows and smoke stains that didn't match any official explanation. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said terrorists had attacked the tower. Others claimed a rogue supe had gone insane. A few shaky cell phone videos already circulating online showed something stranger, bullets stopping midair in a hallway as if physics itself had stalled. In the chaos, Vought's PR machine worked at impossible speed, issuing statements about structural accidents and gas explosions. None of it held together. Too many witnesses had seen too much. Too many employees were talking before NDAs could catch up to them. 3 blocks away, Billy Butcher lowered a pair of binoculars and exhaled slowly. He had been watching sups for years, hunting them, studying how they panicked when something truly dangerous entered the picture. What he saw now was different. This wasn't panic, it was confusion. And confusion, he knew, was where real cracks began. Inside the tower, Gojo had left the boardroom. Not because he was forced out, not because anyone asked him to leave. He simply stood up mid-conversation and announced that sitting still was getting boring. He wanted to see more of the building that had everyone so nervous. No one tried to stop him. Homelander followed at a distance this time, no longer charging ahead, no longer certain what action would accomplish. Maeve walked behind them both, eyes sharp, analyzing rather than reacting. Black Noir shadowed the group silently, still searching for an angle that did not exist. They moved through executive hallways like a strange procession. Employees who hadn't evacuated yet pressed themselves against walls, staring as the group passed. Some recognized Homelander. Some recognized Maeve. All of them stared at the stranger in the middle, the one walking casually while the strongest people in the world treated him like an unexploded bomb. Gojo stopped occasionally to examine framed photos, awards, and promotional posters lining the walls. He commented that the building felt less like a workplace and more like a shrine to itself. The observation wasn't loud, but it carried through the tense silence. Below them, deep underground, Vought's classified containment division was activating systems built in secret over many years. Massive reinforced chambers powered on. Magnetic locks engaged. Devices designed to emit frequencies known to disrupt supe nervous systems began humming to life. These measures had never been used. They had only existed as a last resort in case Homelander ever became uncontrollable. Now they were being prepared for someone else. Ashley's voice came over internal comms, reporting that news helicopters were getting clearer footage of the upper floors. Vought stock had already begun to dip in after-hours trading. The board members watching remotely were demanding immediate action, not explanations. Stan Edgar listened without reacting. He had realized something the others had not. Every attempt to act was escalating the situation faster. Gojo paused in front of a large glass wall overlooking the city. He stared out at Manhattan with genuine appreciation, commenting that it was impressive how many people lived their lives below, completely unaware of the tension building above them. Homelander stepped closer, trying again to reclaim authority through proximity. He told Gojo that he needed to leave the building. The words came out strained, lacking the usual confidence that made people obey without thinking. Gojo glanced sideways at him and asked why. Homelander didn't have an answer that made sense. He couldn't say because you scare us. He couldn't say because we can't control you. So he fell back on the only thing he knew. He said this was his city. Gojo smiled at that. He replied gently that cities didn't belong to individuals, no matter how much they wanted them to. The correction was calm, but it hit Homelander harder than any physical blow could have. At that exact moment, the floor beneath them vibrated faintly. A low hum began to travel through the structure of the building, subtle but noticeable. Maeve's eyes narrowed. She recognized the sound of Vought activating something heavy-duty. Gojo noticed it too. His expression brightened slightly, like someone hearing music start in the distance. He commented that the building itself seemed to be preparing for something, and he was curious to see what. Down in the containment levels, enormous doors began to open. Vought had made a decision. If they couldn't understand him, they would try to trap him. Outside, Butcher watched as additional military vehicles began arriving around the perimeter. Not police, not Vought security, actual military units brought in quietly through back channels. That told him everything he needed to know. This had gone beyond corporate control. Back inside, Gojo continued walking toward a service elevator that none of the executives had mentioned. He stopped in front of it and asked Homelander if this one led somewhere interesting. Homelander hesitated for half a second too long. That hesitation told Gojo everything. He pressed the button himself. As the door slid open, a faint cold air drifted out from below, carrying the mechanical scent of machinery that hadn't been used in years. Gojo stepped inside without waiting, turning back to glance at the others with mild excitement. He asked if they were coming, because it seemed like the building had finally decided to show him something worth seeing. Homelander stepped in after him, jaw tight, followed by Maeve and Noir. The doors closed, and the elevator began descending far deeper than any public floor in Vought Tower. Upstairs, Stan Edgar watched the descent on a private monitor and understood the irreversible step they had just taken. They weren't containing the situation anymore. They were escalating it into territory Vought had sworn never to enter. And the worst part was, the man in the elevator looked pleased. The elevator descended far longer than any executive floor required, passing levels that did not exist on public schematics and floors that only a handful of people inside Vought even knew were real. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with the low mechanical hum of systems that had been dormant for years and were now awakening all at once. Gojo stood at the center of the elevator, hands in his pockets, watching the floor numbers disappear into negative digits with visible interest. He asked lightly whether this was where they kept the secrets they didn't show investors. No one answered. Homelander stared straight ahead, jaw tight, trying to convince himself that whatever waited below would restore the balance that had been slipping since the hallway encounter. Maeve watched the indicator panel instead, recognizing that Vought would only bring them here if they had decided normal solutions were no longer viable. The doors opened into a chamber that felt less like a facility and more like a vault built for something dangerous. Thick, reinforced walls lined with emitters hummed softly. Massive mechanical doors stood open ahead, revealing a circular containment arena surrounded by observation decks behind armored glass. This was not a prison. This was a test site. Gojo stepped out first, looking around with the quiet appreciation of someone walking into a museum exhibit designed for him. He commented that the place had character, which immediately made the technicians in the observation room uneasy. Up above, teams of scientists and engineers monitored readings from dozens of devices aimed directly at the arena. Frequencies designed to overload soup nervous systems began to activate. Invisible waves pulsed through the chamber, calibrated carefully based on decades of research into compound V physiology. They washed over Gojo without effect. He paused mid-step and looked around, as if noticing a change in background noise. He mentioned that the air felt slightly different down here, like the building was trying very hard to do something. In the control room, panic began creeping into professional voices. The instruments that measured neurological disruption showed no response. The systems were working perfectly. The target simply wasn't reacting. Stan Edgar watched the readings without speaking. This was the moment he had feared. The realization that all of Vaught's secret fail-safes were built for one kind of power, and this man did not belong to that category. Homelander stepped forward into the arena, sensing opportunity. If Vaught's systems weakened Gojo even slightly, he intended to exploit it. He cracked his knuckles and squared his shoulders, eager to reclaim the authority that had been slipping from his grasp. Gojo looked at him with mild curiosity and asked if this was finally the part where something interesting happened. The emitters intensified. The hum in the room deepened into a low vibration that rattled the metal railings of the observation deck. Lights flickered as energy draw spiked across the underground grid. Still, Gojo stood casually, unaffected. Homelander charged. He moved faster than before, throwing a full-force punch meant to cave in a tank. His fist stopped inches from Gojo's chest exactly as it had upstairs. The containment frequencies did nothing to change that. Gojo sighed softly, not out of frustration, but mild disappointment. He commented that he had hoped the dramatic setting would at least lead to a new experience. From the observation deck, technicians began activating the second phase of the protocol. Mechanical panels opened along the walls, revealing automated heavy weapon systems designed to fire specialized rounds capable of penetrating soup durability. Turrets rotated and locked onto Gojo's position. They fired in unison. The arena filled with thunderous impacts as hundreds of rounds slammed into the invisible boundary around him and stopped dead in the air. Within seconds, the space around Gojo was filled with suspended bullets, frozen in place like metallic rain. He turned slowly, looking at the hovering projectiles with genuine fascination. He remarked that this was the most creative decoration he had seen in the building so far. In the control room, someone whispered that they were watching the impossible in real time. Maeve, standing at the edge of the arena, felt something shift inside her. This wasn't a fight. This was a revelation. She had spent her life believing sups were the top of the food chain. Now she was watching a man who didn't even acknowledge their efforts. The final phase of the protocol activated. From beneath the arena floor, thick mechanical arms rose up, each tipped with devices designed to emit concentrated bursts meant to shut down soup motor function entirely. These had been built specifically with Homelander in mind, tested in simulations for years, never used in reality. They fired. The pulses hit Gojo and dispersed harmlessly like wind against stone. Gojo blinked once, then looked up toward the observation deck. For the first time since entering the building, his expression changed from amused to mildly thoughtful. He asked politely if they were done trying. The question wasn't loud, but it carried through the speakers into every control room, every monitoring station, every executive office upstairs. Because it implied something dangerous. He had been letting them try. Homelander stepped back, the confidence he had hoped to regain now replaced with something far more unsettling. He realized that none of this had been a struggle for Gojo. It had been entertainment. Gojo raised one hand slightly, and the hundreds of bullets suspended around him shifted position in the air, moving aside gently as if guided by invisible currents. He wasn't attacking. He was clearing his view. He glanced around the arena one more time and commented that the place was impressive, but the performance was disappointing. Then he took a single step forward. The reinforced floor beneath his foot cracked. Not from force, not from impact, but as if the material itself had lost the will to remain solid near him. Up in the control room, alarms began screaming as stress readings across the containment structure spiked wildly. The systems weren't failing from damage. They were failing from proximity. Stan Edgar watched the data scroll across the screen and understood the truth too late. This facility had not been built to contain something like Gojo. It had been built to provoke him. And as the first fractures began spreading through the underground arena walls, Vought realized they had just escalated the situation from observation to consequence. The first crack in the containment arena did not sound loud. It sounded wrong. A deep, slow groan passed through the reinforced walls as if the structure itself had realized it was holding something it did not understand. Dust drifted from the ceiling in thin streams while warning sirens began layering over one another in chaotic rhythm. Gojo stood at the center of the arena, watching the spreading fractures with mild curiosity. He hadn't struck anything. He hadn't pushed. He had simply taken a step, and the building responded like a body recoiling from contact. Above, engineers shouted over each other as structural stress readings climbed past safe limits. They tried rerouting power, cycling systems, anything to stabilize the facility. None of it mattered. The problem was not mechanical. It was conceptual. This place had been designed to contain power that followed rules. Gojo did not. Stan Edgar's voice cut through the panic with cold clarity. He gave a single order to initiate external response. It was the moment Vought admitted the situation had moved beyond corporate control. Miles away, encrypted calls connected to military channels that had been negotiated in secret years ago. Within minutes, aircraft already on standby changed course toward Manhattan. Heavy vehicles surrounding Vought Tower repositioned, no longer forming a perimeter but preparing for engagement. On the streets, civilians watched in confusion as armored convoys rolled past police barricades. News helicopters pivoted their cameras to capture the arrival of something far more serious than crowd control. Speculation online exploded into chaos. 3 blocks away, Billy Butcher watched jets streak across the sky and muttered that Vought had finally done what it always did when it lost control. It called in bigger guns without understanding what it was aiming at. Back underground, Homelander felt the shift before anyone explained it. He heard the distant rumble of aircraft through layers of concrete and steel. He realized Vought had escalated past him. That realization stung more than anything Gojo had done. Gojo glanced upward, sensing the vibration through the structure. He asked casually if they had invited more guests. The tone carried the same light curiosity he had maintained since entering the building. Maeve didn't answer. She was watching the walls crack further, realizing that whatever came next would not be contained to this level. This was about to spill upward, outward, into the city itself. The first explosion came from above. A precision strike slammed into the upper levels of Vought Tower, meant to disable infrastructure and force a controlled evacuation. The shockwave traveled down through the structure and into the underground facility like a hammer hitting a tuning fork. Chunks of ceiling fell, lights burst, dust filled the air in choking clouds. Gojo didn't move. Concrete fragments slowed as they neared him, hovering briefly before drifting harmlessly to the ground. He brushed dust off his sleeve and looked mildly impressed. He commented that this was the most enthusiastic reaction he had seen so far. In the control room, technicians realized the military didn't know what they were doing. They were attacking the building without understanding the problem inside it. Each strike was destabilizing the structure faster. Stan Edgar tried to issue a halt order, but communications were already tangled in overlapping command channels. The situation had become too large for a single voice to control. Outside, jets circled for another pass. Inside the arena, the cracks in the walls widened into splits. Metal supports bent inward with groaning resistance. The containment chamber was seconds away from catastrophic failure. Homelander looked at Gojo, then at the collapsing structure, and made a decision driven by pride more than logic. He grabbed Gojo by the collar and tried to launch upward through the ceiling, intending to remove him from the underground level by force. His hand never touched fabric. It stopped inches away, frozen mid-grab. His momentum halted so abruptly that the recoil threw him backward into a crumbling wall. Gojo watched him slide down the debris and asked gently if he was trying to help. The second missile strike hit. This one tore through multiple upper floors, sending a violent tremor down the building's spine. The underground chamber could no longer hold. With a deafening crack, the ceiling split open, revealing layers of broken floors above like a vertical canyon carved through Vought Tower. Sunlight poured down through the destruction. And for the first time, the outside world had a direct line of sight into what was happening below. News helicopters captured the image instantly. A massive vertical shaft of destruction through the tower, and at the bottom, a lone figure standing calmly amid floating debris and shattered machinery. The footage went live before anyone could stop it. Gojo looked up at the open sky with visible delight. He remarked that he preferred natural lighting anyway. Then, without effort, he stepped upward, walking through the air as if invisible stairs had appeared for him alone. Maeve stared in disbelief as he ascended past broken floors without jumping, without climbing, simply moving upward at a relaxed pace. Outside, thousands of people watched in stunned silence as a man walked out of the destroyed core of Vought Tower and into open air, debris orbiting him like slow-moving satellites. The military pilots hesitated mid-flight. Their targeting systems couldn't lock onto what they were seeing. Inside the collapsing structure, Stan Edgar finally understood the full scale of the mistake. They had escalated from observation to containment, from containment to force, and from force to public spectacle. And Gojo had not attacked once. He had simply existed. As Gojo reached the height of the broken tower, hovering in open air above Manhattan, he looked down at the city, at the circling helicopters, at the approaching jets, and smiled faintly. He asked aloud, to no one in particular, if this was finally the interesting part. Below him, Vought Tower continued to crumble from the inside out, and the entire world watched live as the illusion of controlled power collapsed in real time. The live feeds did not cut away. They couldn't. Too many networks had already picked up the footage from news helicopters circling above Manhattan. Too many phones were pointed at the sky from streets packed with people staring upward in disbelief. What had started as a corporate crisis inside a sealed building had become a global broadcast in less than 10 minutes. Vought Tower stood split open like a cracked monument, smoke drifting from its upper floors while debris rained slowly down the sides. And above the ruined spine of the building, a white-haired man hovered calmly in open air, fragments of concrete and glass suspended around him as if gravity had temporarily lost authority. Inside emergency vans and command vehicles, officials argued over what to do next. Military pilots circled at a distance, awaiting orders they were no longer confident in following. Targeting systems refused to lock properly, confused by readings that didn't match anything in their databases. Gojo looked around with open appreciation, as though he had stepped onto a scenic overlook rather than the center of a crisis. He tilted his head slightly at one of the helicopters, studying the camera mounted beneath it, fully aware that millions of people were now watching him in real time. He gave a small, friendly wave. On the streets below, the crowd's reaction shifted from fear to something stranger. Confusion, awe. People were used to seeing sups fly. They were not used to seeing one do nothing while the world around him unraveled. Inside the ruined tower, Homelander blasted upward through layers of broken floors and emerged into the open air behind Gojo. His cape snapped violently in the wind as he hovered there, trying to reassert the image the world expected to see. Two figures in the sky. One belonged there. The other did not. Homelander shouted at him to come down, to stop this, to fix what he had caused. The words came out louder than necessary, broadcast through helicopter microphones to anyone watching. It sounded less like a command and more like a plea. Gojo glanced over his shoulder and asked, gently, what exactly he was supposed to fix. The question landed harder than any attack. Because there was no destruction Gojo had caused. Every crack in the tower, every explosion, every collapse had come from Vought and the military trying to respond to him. He had not thrown a single strike. On a nearby rooftop, Billy Butcher watched through binoculars and muttered that this was the most honest thing he had ever seen happen to Vought. The world was watching them panic in real time, and there was no villain to blame it on. Inside a mobile command center, government officials argued about whether this was still a soup-related incident or something else entirely. No one wanted to be the first to admit they didn't know. Gojo slowly descended, not falling, not flying, simply lowering himself through the air toward a nearby rooftop. He landed lightly and looked out across the city skyline, as if appreciating the view after a long walk. Homelander followed, landing harder than necessary, cracking the rooftop beneath his boots. He stood there, chest rising and falling, trying to regain composure while cameras zoomed in from every angle. Gojo turned to face him fully for the first time since entering the building. He studied Homelander's expression with open curiosity and commented that he seemed very stressed for someone who was supposed to be the strongest person here. Homelander's eyes flared red again, but he didn't fire. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew everyone was watching, and somewhere deep inside, he knew it wouldn't work. The hesitation was visible, and the world saw it. News anchors struggled to narrate what they were witnessing. Words like unknown entity, unidentified soup, and possible foreign weapon were thrown around without conviction. None of them explained why Homelander looked unsure. Gojo glanced at the circling jets and asked if they planned to keep flying in circles or actually try something. His tone was conversational, but the implication sent a ripple of tension through every command channel listening in. One pilot, under pressure from overlapping orders, finally fired a warning missile. The projectile streaked toward the rooftop in a screaming arc, visible to every camera watching. It was meant to land nearby, to intimidate, not to kill. The missile stopped midair 20 feet from Gojo and hung there silently. The city went quiet. No explosions, no impacts, just a suspended weapon frozen in the sky like a paused video frame. Gojo walked closer to it, examining the metal casing with interest. He tapped it lightly with a finger that never quite touched the surface, then looked back at the jets and remarked that this was getting repetitive. Behind him, Homelander watched the missile hang motionless and felt something inside his chest tighten. This wasn't about strength anymore. It was about irrelevance. Gojo wasn't fighting him. He was demonstrating that none of them mattered. Across the world, viewers began asking the same question in different languages. Who is that? And why does Homelander look like he can't do anything about him? Back in what remained of Vought Tower, Stan Edgar watched the live feed without speaking. He understood now that the damage was no longer structural or tactical. It was reputational, psychological, permanent. Vought's image had always relied on the belief that sups were the highest authority on power. And now the entire planet had watched that belief dissolve in under an hour. On the rooftop, Gojo finally looked slightly less amused. Not angry, not serious, just thoughtful. He glanced back at the broken tower and then out at the watching city. He remarked quietly that this place had built a system around people who didn't understand the weight of what they were given. And then he looked back at Homelander and asked a question that no one in Vought had ever dared to ask him. He asked if he even knew why he was strong. Homelander didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. And as the missile continued to hang silently in the air between them, the world realized this wasn't a battle unfolding. It was an exposure. The rooftop standoff did not end with an explosion. It ended with silence that spread outward through the city like a pressure wave. Helicopters kept their distance. Jets widened their circles. No one wanted to be the next to try something that would simply stop in midair and embarrass them in front of the world. Gojo left the missile hanging where it was and began walking across the rooftop, hands in his pockets, as if he had grown bored of the view. Homelander stayed where he stood, watching him move with a frustration that cameras caught from every angle. The strongest man in the world had been reduced to observing someone else's pace. Across Manhattan, people began recording from windows and rooftops. Social media filled with the same image from 100 angles, a quiet stranger moving casually while the entire city held its breath. The narrative Vought had controlled for decades was dissolving into something they couldn't shape. 3 blocks away, Billy Butcher lowered his binoculars and made a decision. He turned to Mother's Milk and told him they were moving closer, not to attack, to see. Because whatever this man was, he wasn't acting like a soup, and that alone made him worth understanding. Inside emergency command vehicles, government officials were no longer discussing engagement. They were discussing containment of information. The problem had shifted from stopping Gojo to explaining him, and there were no good explanations. Gojo reached the edge of the rooftop and looked down at the streets below, where crowds had gathered behind police lines. He leaned forward slightly, observing the people with genuine interest. He commented softly that they looked more curious than afraid. Homelander finally spoke again, telling him to get away from the edge. The instruction came out instinctively, like a warning to a civilian rather than a command to a threat. The shift in tone did not go unnoticed. Gojo glanced back and asked if Homelander was worried about the people below. The question carried no accusation. It was simple curiosity. Homelander didn't answer, because he didn't know if he was. From a nearby building, Maeve watched the exchange from a shattered window, piecing together what had been happening since the hallway encounter. This man wasn't humiliating Homelander with force. He was forcing him into moments of self-awareness he had never experienced. That was far more dangerous. Gojo straightened and looked across the skyline again. His attention shifted toward the approaching sound of footsteps on the stairwell behind them. Butcher and his team emerged cautiously onto the rooftop, weapons ready but clearly unsure whether they were relevant anymore. Butcher stopped when he saw the missile hanging in the air and let out a low whistle. He muttered that this was new, even for him. Gojo turned toward the newcomers with a friendly expression. He greeted them like late arrivals to a gathering and asked if they worked here too. Butcher shook his head slowly and said they definitely did not. For a brief moment, the tension on the rooftop changed. It was no longer just Vought versus an unknown presence. It was Vought, the military, civilians, vigilantes, and sups all orbiting around a man who had not declared himself against anyone. Gojo studied Butcher with interest. He commented that this one didn't carry himself like the others in the tower. Butcher replied that he didn't like sups much, which made Gojo laugh quietly. He said that was understandable. Homelander's frustration spiked at the sight of Butcher standing casually near Gojo without fear. The psychological balance was shifting in ways he could not control. People who should have been terrified were now simply observing. From the streets below, chants began to rise. Not organized, not unified, just noise from a crowd trying to process something unprecedented. Some shouted for Homelander. Others shouted questions no one could answer. Gojo looked down again and then back at the group on the rooftop. He remarked that the situation had grown bigger than the building now. What started as curiosity had turned into a public event. Butcher asked him bluntly what he was planning to do. Gojo thought about it honestly and admitted he hadn't decided yet. He was still learning how this world worked, still observing the systems built around power and fear. That answer unsettled everyone more than a threat would have, because it meant the outcome depended entirely on what he concluded. In the distance, sirens grew louder as more emergency vehicles arrived. News drones hovered at the edges of the airspace, capturing everything from safe distances. The image of the suspended missile had already become a symbol spreading across the internet faster than Vought could react. Maeve realized something with quiet clarity. This man wasn't creating resistance. He was revealing it. People who had accepted Vought's authority for years were now seeing how fragile it really was, all because someone had arrived who didn't play by the same rules. Gojo glanced up at the sky one more time and then back at the broken tower behind them. His expression shifted slightly, not into seriousness, but into a thoughtful calm that hadn't been there before. He said softly that he had seen enough to understand the shape of things here. And that understanding was beginning to change his mood. Homelander felt it immediately. Not a change in power, but a change in intention. The casual amusement that had defined Gojo's behavior since arriving was thinning, replaced by quiet evaluation. For the first time, Homelander realized the real danger was what Gojo could do physically. It was what he might decide needed to be corrected. And as Gojo stepped away from the rooftop edge and looked directly at the ruined Vought Tower, the people watching around the world felt the same subtle shift without knowing why. The visitor was no longer just observing. He was forming an opinion. The change was not loud, and it was not dramatic. It was visible only in the way Gojo stopped looking around like a tourist and started looking at things like a teacher, grading a test he already knew the answers to. The smile that had hovered on his face since he entered Vought Tower faded into a thoughtful calm that made the air on the rooftop feel heavier. Homelander noticed it first. He didn't understand why, but he felt the difference instantly. Up until now, he had been the subject of Gojo's curiosity. Now he felt like he was being evaluated. Gojo turned away from the skyline and faced the ruined tower behind them. Smoke still drifted upward from fractured floors while sirens echoed faintly through the city. He studied the damage quietly, as if tracing a line backward from consequence to cause. He spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, and observed that this entire chain of destruction had happened without him attacking once. The building had broken itself trying to respond to his presence. The military had fired because it didn't understand what it was seeing. The strongest man in the world had thrown himself into walls because he couldn't process what wasn't obeying him. The realization settled over everyone listening. This chaos had been self-inflicted. Billy Butcher watched Gojo's expression change and felt something unfamiliar, caution. This wasn't the look of a man enjoying the show anymore. It was the look of someone deciding whether the show needed to end. Homelander stepped forward, trying again to reassert something, anything. He demanded to know what Gojo wanted. The question came out sharp, but underneath it was something new. Concern. Gojo looked at him and answered honestly. He said he had wanted to understand how this world handled power. Now, he understood enough to know that it handled it very poorly. Those words didn't sound like an insult. They sounded like a conclusion. On nearby rooftops and inside helicopters, microphones caught every syllable. Across the world, viewers listened as a stranger calmly judged the system that had defined modern heroism for decades. Maeve felt her chest tighten. She had known Vought was rotten for years, but hearing someone say it so plainly, without anger or bitterness, made it impossible to ignore. He wasn't condemning them emotionally. He was stating a fact. Gojo stepped toward the edge of the rooftop again, but this time he wasn't looking at the people below. He was looking at the entire city, at the structures, the crowds, the layers of human life built under the shadow of manufactured gods. He said quietly that power given without understanding always turns into fear, and fear always turns into control. No one interrupted him. Because for the first time since this began, it didn't feel like he was talking casually. It felt like he was reaching a decision. Homelander felt something close to panic rise in his chest. He realized that if Gojo decided Vought was a problem, there was nothing he could do to stop what came next. Not with strength, not with threats, not with reputation. For the first time in his life, Homelander understood what it felt like to be powerless in the presence of someone stronger. Gojo turned back toward him and asked a simple question. He asked if Homelander had ever chosen to be strong, or if he had simply been told he was. The question hit harder than any physical strike could have. Homelander opened his mouth to respond and found that he didn't have an answer that made sense. Because the truth was uncomfortable. He had never chosen anything. He had been shaped, guided, controlled, marketed, and worshipped into the role he played. And now, under Gojo's calm gaze, that role felt artificial. Below them, the crowd noise had quieted into a low murmur. People sensed that something important was happening even if they couldn't articulate what it was. Gojo looked back at the ruined tower one more time and exhaled softly. He admitted that he had hoped this visit would be entertaining for longer, but now that he understood the structure behind it, he found it less amusing. That statement sent a chill through everyone listening. Because if he was no longer amused, then his next actions would not be guided by curiosity. They would be guided by judgment. Billy Butcher watched closely, realizing that this moment was bigger than Vought, bigger than Sups, bigger than his personal war. This was someone from outside the system deciding whether the system deserved to continue existing. Gojo raised one hand slightly, not in attack, not in preparation but in contemplation. The air around him seemed to grow denser, as if the world itself was waiting for what he might do next. Homelander took an involuntary step backward. And for the first time since Gojo arrived, there was no humor left in the situation. Only the quiet understanding that something irreversible was about to happen. The rooftop no longer felt like a stage, it felt like a courtroom. Gojo stood in silence for several seconds, looking down at his raised hand as if measuring something invisible between his fingers. The city noise below had dulled into a distant murmur, and even the helicopters seemed to keep a wider distance, their rotors no longer daring to intrude too closely into the stillness around him. Homelander watched with a tightening chest, every instinct screaming at him to do something, to reclaim control, to interrupt whatever was happening. But he had learned the hard way that force meant nothing here. So he stood there, waiting, which was something he had never been forced to do before. Gojo lowered his hand slowly and looked out across Manhattan again. He spoke calmly, almost gently, and observed that this world had confused spectacle with responsibility, that it had taken people with power and wrapped them in expectations without ever teaching them what that power meant. The words were not loud, but they carried through microphones and live feeds into millions of homes. Maeve felt like she was listening to someone describe her entire life in one sentence. Gojo's gaze drifted back to Vought Tower, split open and still smoking. He pointed toward it lightly and remarked that this building was a monument to misunderstanding. Not evil, not cruelty, just a complete lack of comprehension about what happens when you give humans godlike ability without guiding their minds. Stan Edgar watched the broadcast from a secure location miles away. He had spent decades believing Vought controlled the narrative around power. Now, he was watching someone rewrite it in real time without raising his voice. Gojo stepped forward, and for the first time since arriving, the air around him reacted visibly. Dust and small debris on the rooftop began to shift outward in slow, gentle waves, as if pushed away by something intangible. Homelander felt the pressure immediately. Not physical pain, but resistance, like trying to walk into strong wind. He realized with a sinking feeling that Gojo was no longer just standing there. He was allowing a fraction of himself to be felt. Gojo glanced at Homelander and spoke softly. He said that none of this had to escalate, but it would depend entirely on whether the people in charge understood what they had done. That statement wasn't directed at Homelander alone. It was directed at Vought, the military, the government, everyone watching. Billy Butcher listened carefully, recognizing the shift. This wasn't a visitor anymore. This was a judge offering a final chance before passing sentence. In the distance, sirens and helicopters continued their restless motion, but no one dared initiate another attack. The memory of the frozen missile still hung in everyone's mind like a warning. Gojo closed his eyes briefly, as if focusing inward. When he opened them again, there was no amusement left, only clarity. He said that if this system continued as it was, it would eventually harm far more people than it protected. And he said it like someone stating an inevitable fact. Homelander felt anger surge up, not at Gojo, but at the truth buried in those words. He wanted to deny it, to shout, to prove otherwise. But deep inside, he knew the system had never been about protection. It had been about image. Gojo looked back at him and asked one last question. He asked if Homelander was willing to change. The question hung between them in the air, heavy with implication. Because if the answer was no, Gojo would no longer be observing. He would be acting. Homelander opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He didn't know how to answer. Change had never been part of his world. Obedience, dominance, fear, admiration, yes. But change required understanding, and he had never been taught how to do that. The silence was answer enough. Gojo nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself. He turned away from Homelander and looked toward the shattered tower again. The ground beneath his feet cracked slightly, not from force, but from the invisible pressure of something vast beginning to stir. Across the world, viewers felt a strange sense of anticipation they couldn't explain. The situation had moved past spectacle, past confusion, into something that felt like a turning point. Gojo spoke quietly, almost to himself. He said that observation was over, and judgment had begun. The moment after Gojo said the word judgment, nothing exploded. There was no blast, no flash of light, no dramatic movement. Instead, the city felt like it had been placed under a weight that no one could see. Conversations on the streets below slowed. Helicopter pilots adjusted their distance without being told. Even the wind across the rooftop seemed to quiet. Gojo stood perfectly still, eyes open, gaze resting on the broken spine of Vought Tower. He didn't look angry, he didn't look emotional, he looked certain. Homelander felt the certainty like a physical thing pressing against his chest. It was the same sensation he used to create in others when he stood too close, the unspoken message that he could end them whenever he wanted. Now he was on the receiving end of that feeling, and it unsettled him more than any failed attack. Gojo lifted his hand slightly, palm facing the tower. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then the air between his hand and the building seemed to fold inward, like space itself tightening. The upper half of Vought Tower didn't explode. It compressed. Glass, steel, and concrete bent inward silently, crushed by a force that did not announce itself with noise. People watching from the streets gasped as the top floors of the tower warped like soft clay under invisible pressure. Gojo lowered his hand. The compression stopped. He hadn't destroyed the building. He had demonstrated how easily he could. Across the city, a wave of realization spread faster than fear. This was not an attack. This was a warning delivered with surgical precision. Billy Butcher stared, eyes wide, understanding the message instantly. Gojo wasn't trying to kill anyone. He was showing them the scale of difference between what they thought power was and what it actually looked like. On the rooftop, Homelander's confidence finally cracked completely. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a ceiling he could never reach. For the first time in his life, he understood that no matter how strong he was, there existed something beyond him that didn't even need to try. Gojo turned back toward him calmly. He said that he had no interest in destroying the city or harming people who had nothing to do with the system built above them. But he made it clear that the system itself could not continue unchanged. Those words traveled through microphones into command centers, into Vaught's remaining offices, into government channels. Everyone understood the implication. This wasn't a battle to be won. This was an ultimatum. Maeve watched with quiet intensity, realizing that this moment was the closest thing to justice she had ever witnessed. Not revenge, not chaos, just someone powerful enough to force accountability without needing to scream. Gojo looked down at the streets again and then back at the rooftop group. He said softly that he would give them time. Time to decide whether they wanted to continue pretending or start understanding what power was supposed to mean. Homelander didn't argue, he didn't threaten, he didn't posture. He simply stood there silent, processing a reality he had never imagined. The helicopters kept filming, the world kept watching. And for the first time since Sups had entered public life, people realized something fundamental. They had never seen real power before. Gojo took a step backward toward the edge of the rooftop. The pressure in the air began to fade slightly as he relaxed whatever invisible force he had allowed to leak into the world. He glanced once more at the broken tower and said quietly that he hoped they chose wisely. Then he stepped off the rooftop. Not falling, not flying, simply descending through the air at a calm pace, drifting toward the street below as if gravity had become a suggestion rather than a rule. Every camera followed him, because everyone understood that this was not the end of what had started today. It was the beginning of consequences. Gojo's descent through open air was slow enough for the entire city to follow with their eyes. Helicopters tracked him from a distance. News drones hovered carefully at the edge of whatever invisible boundary they felt, but could not measure, and thousands of people leaned over barricades to watch him approach the street, as if they were witnessing something sacred rather than chaotic. He touched down lightly on the pavement in front of Vought Tower's outer perimeter, surrounded by shattered glass, emergency vehicles, and a crowd that didn't know whether to run or stay exactly where they were. Police officers stood frozen behind their cars, unsure whether their presence mattered anymore. Gojo looked around at the people first, not the building. His expression softened slightly as he took in their confusion, their fear, and their curiosity all at once. He commented quietly that they looked very normal for people living under very abnormal circumstances. Billy Butcher pushed through the edge of the crowd and stopped a short distance away, studying Gojo with the same cautious interest he had carried all day. For once, he had no plan, no angle, no weapon that felt relevant. He simply wanted to hear what this man would say next. Above them, the warped upper floors of Vought Tower groaned faintly in the wind, a permanent scar in the skyline that would never be explained away by public relations. Homelander remained on the rooftop, staring down at the scene below. He didn't descend. He didn't announce himself. He watched from a distance, no longer certain that stepping into the same space as Gojo would restore anything. Gojo turned in a slow circle, looking at the crowd, the emergency lights, the broken glass, the cameras pointed at him from every angle. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying farther than it should have without him raising it. He said that none of the people standing here were the problem. The problem was the structure built above them that had confused power with permission and fear with order. The words were simple, but they landed with weight that spread through the crowd like a quiet wave. Butcher asked him plainly what he was going to do now. Gojo looked at him and smiled faintly. He said he wasn't here to rule this world or fix it for them. He had only come to understand it, and now that he did, the responsibility belonged to the people who lived in it. That answer surprised everyone listening, because it meant he wasn't staying to impose change. He was leaving behind the knowledge that change was necessary. Gojo glanced back up at the tower one last time. He remarked that buildings could be repaired, images could be rebuilt, but what people had seen today could not be undone. He took a few steps forward through the debris-strewn street, and the crowd instinctively parted without being told to. No one tried to stop him. No one tried to approach him. They simply watched him pass like a quiet force of nature moving through their lives. Homelander finally descended from the rooftop, landing several meters away. He didn't speak. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at Gojo with an expression that had never been captured on camera before. Uncertainty. Gojo met his gaze briefly and said softly that strength meant nothing if you didn't understand why you had it. The statement wasn't accusatory. It was almost sympathetic. Homelander didn't respond, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't confirm the truth in those words. Sirens continued to echo through the streets, but no one moved to detain Gojo. No one issued commands. The situation had moved beyond law enforcement, beyond military protocol, beyond corporate authority. Gojo reached the end of the street, where the crowds thinned and the noise of the city returned to something resembling normal life. He paused there for a moment and looked back over his shoulder at Vought Tower, at the helicopters, at the people still staring. He said quietly that he hoped they learned from this. Then, without fanfare, without light or sound, he vanished. 1 second he was standing there. The next he was gone. The crowd stood in stunned silence, unsure whether they had just witnessed the end of something or the beginning of something far larger. Because Vought Tower was still broken. Homelander was still standing in the street, unsure of himself. And millions of people around the world had just seen that the strongest beings they knew were not actually at the top of the hierarchy. The world could not return to what it had been that morning. Not after seeing what real power looked like. And somewhere far away, beyond their sight, Gojo carried with him an understanding of this world that would shape what happened the next time he decided to visit.